In a small, forgotten corner of history, there exists a brutal spectacle that once captivated the masses, an atrocity so grotesque, yet so deeply woven into the fabric of human nature, that it left thousands cheering in twisted exhilaration. It's a scene so horrifying, it feels like it belongs in the darkest pages of a crime novel. Yet it was real. The ancient art of boiling criminals alive, a horrific form of execution, was not only a punishment, it was a twisted form of entertainment. Imagine a crowd gathered, eagerly anticipating the grim fate of a condemned man, his screams echoing as he's lowered into the cauldron of searing water. The onlookers? They are not filled with pity, but with a sick, almost savage thrill. They cheer. They chant. They demand more. Why? And how did such a barbaric practice become a public spectacle, one that would see the criminal boiling alive under the eyes of thousands? The story of this chilling history begins here, and it's about to get darker. The ancient world was no stranger to brutality. In fact, it often seemed like cruelty was the currency of power, its price paid with the lives of those unlucky enough to cross the line. But there was one method of execution that stood above the rest in terms of its barbarity, its public spectacle, and its ability to stir the darkest part of human nature. Boiling criminals alive wasn't just a punishment. It was an act of public theater designed to invoke a primal response from the crowd. It was a death sentence, yes, but it was more than that. It was a form of control, a way to enforce the dominance of the state over the lives of its people. But how did this grotesque form of execution come to be? And why did crowds cheer when the condemned were lowered into the cauldron? It began with the simple, ancient idea of using death as a deterrent. But this wasn't enough for some rulers. They needed something more, a show that not only punished but also entertained. As the Roman Empire reached its zenith, its leaders became obsessed with finding new ways to display their power. Execution wasn't just for the criminal, it was for the masses. They needed a reminder of their ruler's power, a visceral display of strength. And nothing screamed dominance like watching a man writhing in a boiling cauldron. The practice wasn't limited to any one region or culture. The idea of boiling criminals alive spread across the globe, appearing in different places at different times. But it was most famously practiced in Europe, where it became a method of execution sanctioned by law. It was seen not only as a fitting punishment for certain crimes, but also as a way to entertain and control the population. Why boiling? The answer lies in the sheer horror of it. A man placed into a cauldron of boiling water or oil would die in unimaginable pain, his body writhing and his skin slowly disintegrating. But this wasn't a quiet death. The agony of the condemned was on full display for all to witness. It became a spectacle that was impossible to ignore. The more gruesome, the more enthralling it became for the crowd. And the more people cheered. As horrifying as it sounds today, the boiling death was viewed differently by those who lived through it. For them, it wasn't just a punishment, it was a form of justice. When a criminal was boiled alive, it was a public act of retribution. The masses saw it as a necessary step for maintaining order, a brutal yet efficient way to rid society of those who had broken its most sacred rules. But who were these criminals? What crimes could one commit to earn such a gruesome fate? As the practice became more popular, the reasons behind it grew ever darker. Stealing food during times of famine, attacking a high-ranking official, or even daring to question the authority of the king. These were all reasons someone could find themselves cast into the boiling pot. And so, the ritual was born, a grim tradition of boiling alive, where power, fear, and a deep sense of justice all intersected. But the true horror came not from the crime itself, but from the spectacle that followed. And as the flames crackled beneath the cauldron, the crowd roared, chanting in unison. They were not just spectators. They were participants in a gruesome spectacle that satisfied some dark craving deep within their souls. The death of a man became a form of collective entertainment, a twisted reminder of the ruler's absolute power. But how did this practice, this barbaric and inhumane form of justice, come to be so widely accepted? To answer that, we must step deeper into history, where politics and power created the perfect storm for such grotesque rituals to flourish. As the fire crackled beneath the cauldron, the scene was far from a simple execution. It was a public event, a grim spectacle designed to leave a lasting impression on those who watched. And it was more than just a display of power, it was entertainment. The crowd's roars of approval, the eager anticipation, and the collective bloodlust that filled the air, it all pointed to one chilling reality. This was a society that found a strange pleasure in watching a life end in the most horrific way imaginable. In ancient Rome, public executions were the ultimate form of spectacle, a way for rulers to demonstrate their authority while keeping the masses entertained. But unlike other forms of execution, such as crucifixion or beheading, the act of boiling alive was especially grotesque, leaving no room for any hint of dignity. And so, it became a highlight, a must-see event in the bloody lineup of public executions. But the crowds weren't just gathering for justice. They were coming for the show. These executions were like a morbid circus act, where the condemned would dance their final moments in front of an eager audience, their agony amplified by the cruel and drawn-out nature of their death. The boiling cauldron was a symbol of this twisted spectacle. It wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about creating a visceral experience for everyone who attended. This transformation of punishment into entertainment wasn't unique to Rome. Throughout history, many societies have used public executions as a form of entertainment, both to instill fear and to keep the masses entertained. In the medieval period, executions were often held in marketplaces, where crowds would gather to witness the brutal consequences of defying authority. But unlike executions that ended quickly, the slow and painful process of boiling alive allowed for a prolonged and gruesome performance. It was a drawn-out affair that gave the crowd plenty of time to cheer, jeer, and revel in the suffering of the condemned. Why was this such a powerful spectacle? It's not just the violence, it's the helplessness. A person being boiled alive was a slow, agonizing process. Unlike hanging or beheading, which could be relatively quick, the boiling process gave the audience the satisfaction of watching the victim suffer, knowing there was no escape. The condemned were often thrown into large vats of boiling oil or water, and the process could take hours, depending on the size of the cauldron and the victim's endurance. The crowd could see the body reacting, the skin peeling away, the victim's last moments stretched out in a horrific show for all to witness. But the truth behind the bloodlust was darker still. The crowd's enthusiasm didn't just stem from sadistic pleasure. It was a reflection of the harsh realities of life in these times. The masses, living in fear of both external and internal threats, needed these executions to feel secure. They needed to know that there were consequences for defying the law, no matter how severe the punishment might be. And in times when survival was a daily struggle, witnessing such an extreme punishment provided a sixth sense of control over a chaotic world. The boiling executions, then, were a tool of the rulers, who used the spectacle to maintain order by instilling fear. But as the practice continued, it became ingrained in society's collective psyche, feeding off the very bloodlust it was supposed to control. In fact, in some cases, the crowd would even demand the death of specific criminals, turning the execution into a form of mob justice. The ruler's power, which should have been absolute, was often directly influenced by the crowd's approval. This dark tradition wasn't without its controversies, of course. There were those who saw these public executions as barbaric and unnecessary, even in an era when cruelty seemed to be an accepted part of governance. Some tried to put an end to the practice, but in a world where fear and control went hand in hand, these efforts were often futile. The boiling cauldron was too deeply entrenched in the cultural fabric of the time to be easily uprooted. But even as the practice of boiling criminals alive continued, something began to shift. The public's fascination with these spectacles started to wane. As societies evolved, so did their sense of justice. The idea of punishing a criminal by such a gruesome method began to feel increasingly out of place in the more enlightened societies of the time. Yet, before it was finally banned in most parts of the world, it had already carved a deep, horrifying mark in history. As we move into the deeper layers of this tradition, we'll see how boiling criminals to death became not just a political tool, but a deeply symbolic practice that transcended the execution itself. It was a twisted reflection of a world that thrived on fear, violence, and control. And in the next chapter, we'll uncover the politics behind the practice, how rulers used it not only to punish, but to dominate. To understand why boiling criminals alive became so widespread, we need to dive into the politics of the era. This wasn't just a practice born out of the need for retribution. It was a deliberate political strategy, designed not only to punish but to assert power in a society where rulers sought control over every aspect of their subjects' lives. In the ancient and medieval worlds, the power of a ruler was always challenged by the threat of rebellion. While most monarchs and emperors had their armies to protect their rule, some understood that true power didn't lie solely in force. It lay in the fear of the people. And what better way to establish an unshakable authority than by publicizing the gruesome consequences of defying that authority? Boiling criminals to death was an incredibly effective way of asserting dominance, especially in societies where displays of power were paramount. When a ruler authorized such a brutal punishment, they were sending a clear message: defy the law, and this could be your fate. But it wasn't just about fear, it was about spectacle. The public nature of these executions helped cement the ruler's image as an unyielding figure, one who would not hesitate to impose the most horrific consequences on those who challenged their authority. Historically, this method of execution became especially popular in regimes where the monarch or ruler feared dissent or rebellion. In places like medieval Europe, monarchs relied on public executions to demonstrate their control over the population. But unlike the relatively swift execution of criminals by hanging or beheading, the boiling process was slow, excruciating, and left a permanent mark on the collective memory of the people. Rulers often chose criminals who were seen as particularly dangerous, such as thieves, political traitors, or enemies of the crown. This choice was no accident. The boiling of criminals was not just a form of punishment. It was also a method for the ruler to create a public spectacle that could turn the tide of popular opinion in their favor. By punishing someone deemed a traitor or an enemy of the state in such a horrific way, the ruler was presenting themselves as the protector of the realm, sending a message that anyone who went against the state would face a fate far worse than death. One of the most famous examples of this brutal tactic occurred during the reign of King Henry VIII of England. In a time of political and religious turmoil, Henry used public executions to remind the population of his unassailable power. It wasn't enough for him to simply execute a criminal. He needed to make an example of them. The punishment had to be both horrific and public, and boiling alive became one of the most effective ways to do so. This form of punishment also appealed to rulers because it allowed them to wield justice in a way that was deeply personal. When the monarch or emperor gave the order for boiling, they were taking an active role in the life or death fate of their subjects. It wasn't an impersonal execution carried out by a lowly executioner. It was a political decision made from the highest authority, and that made it even more terrifying for the common people. As the practice spread, it became a symbol of absolute control. In countries like China, for example, the emperor would often issue the most severe punishments to those who were seen as a threat to his reign, such as corrupt officials or traitors. The boiling of such individuals became a way for the emperor to assert his authority not just over his enemies, but over his entire empire. It was a reminder to everyone that no one was safe from the wrath of the throne. But the popularity of boiling criminals didn't just come from the minds of political leaders, it came from the culture of the time. Societies that embraced a culture of honor and harsh justice saw these punishments as necessary to maintain order. The state had the power to take life at will, and in many cases, the people not only accepted this but also took pleasure in it. After all, the public execution was as much about the people as it was about the ruler. It became a twisted form of communal activity, something that bound the public together under a shared sense of vengeance and authority. As the practice became more widespread, it wasn't just about making examples of criminals. It was about the power of the state to manipulate the emotions of the masses. These executions became a tool for shaping public perception, turning the ruler's authority into something nearly untouchable. For those in power, it was a deadly combination of control, fear, and spectacle, three forces that reinforced each other in a cruel cycle. But the boiling cauldron wasn't just about instilling fear in the common folk. It was also about creating a sense of cultural norm. It was about reminding the people that punishment could come in forms far worse than anything they could imagine, and that the state had the ability to deliver that punishment without hesitation. By now, The boiling punishment had evolved into something much more than a cruel execution. It had become a cultural institution. It was no longer just a method for disposing of criminals. It had become part of the societal fabric. To understand the full scope of its power, we must examine the process itself, the gruesome details of how the boiling took place, how it was carried out, and what it truly meant for the people who witnessed it. As we move forward, we'll explore the agonizing reality of the boiling process, how it took the lives of its victims and left an indelible mark on the minds of those who saw it unfold. And yet, despite its horrors, it remained a powerful tool in the hands of those who ruled. To truly grasp the horror of boiling a human alive, we must understand not only the cultural and political forces that made it a popular form of execution, but also the brutal reality of the process itself. How did the execution unfold, and why was it so deeply agonizing for the condemned? In this chapter, we'll delve into the science behind this horrifying method of death. The boiling process wasn't a quick death. It was an excruciatingly slow and drawn-out affair. When a condemned man was placed into the boiling cauldron, it wasn't merely the heat that killed him. The victim's body would undergo a terrifying series of reactions, each more agonizing than the last. The boiling liquid would first begin to cause the skin to burn, blister, and peel away from the body. The outer layers of tissue would break down, and the flesh would begin to dissolve. But the most horrifying part of this was the fact that, even as the body began to disintegrate, the victim could still feel pain. The body's nerve endings would continue to send signals to the brain, even as the skin and tissues were literally melting away. The scientific aspect of this death ritual stems from the fact that the human body is a delicate system, susceptible to temperature extremes. The average human body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius, and any significant deviation from this causes severe damage. Boiling water, on the other hand, is typically around 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius, far hotter than any human can survive. The rapid temperature change would cause the body to go into shock, with the heart racing to try to keep up, blood pressure fluctuating wildly, and organs failing one by one. The agony started almost immediately. The moment a person was submerged in boiling liquid, their body would react violently. The skin, which is the body's largest organ, would begin to break down almost instantly. At first, the skin would blister and turn red, but it wouldn't be long before the deeper tissues began to break apart as well. The heat would cause the blood vessels to rupture, leading to massive internal bleeding. As the body struggled to keep its equilibrium, the pain would become unbearable. The victim's screams would echo across the crowd, amplifying the horror of the moment. But the physical pain was not the only agony the condemned suffered. The psychological torment of knowing they would never escape this fate, of feeling their own body breaking down piece by piece, would have been nearly unbearable. The sense of helplessness, the realization that there was no chance of survival, would have left the victim in a state of utter terror. And yet, the spectators, cheering, chanting, watching the victim slowly die, would make the experience even more haunting. The final moments of life, in a boiling cauldron, were as much about psychological destruction as physical agony. In many cases, the process could take hours. The victim's body wouldn't just boil, it would burn, disintegrate, and decompose right before the crowd's eyes. There was no chance for a quick death. It was a slow and agonizing process that dragged on, prolonging the suffering of the condemned until their body was little more than a mass of charred, liquefied tissue. The sheer brutality of this punishment wasn't lost on the victims. They would often struggle against the inevitable, thrashing about in a desperate attempt to escape their fate. But no matter how much they fought, the boiling water would not relent. It was a death designed not only to kill, but to make the victim's final moments as unbearable as possible. As horrific as it may seem, the boiling method of execution had a very specific purpose. It wasn't meant to be quick, it was meant to be prolonged. In a world where rulers and monarchs fought for dominance, a slow and painful death was a way of showing that there were no limits to the power of the state. The boiling cauldron was the ultimate symbol of that power. It was an execution that not only destroyed the body, but also shattered the spirit. What made the boiling method even more horrific was the fact that it could take so long to kill the condemned. In some cases, The victim would be submerged in the boiling liquid for over an hour. The body would continue to react violently, skin peeling away, muscles spasming, and organs rupturing. But the victim's body would never fully die until the process had run its course. The slow progression of death, as the body struggled to survive against insurmountable odds, made the punishment all the more chilling. But the science behind the death doesn't stop there. The boiling liquid itself wasn't always water. It could be anything from hot oil to a mixture of both. Oil was particularly effective because it could burn hotter and more slowly, causing even more excruciating damage to the body. Some accounts even suggest that criminals were sometimes boiled in oil so thick it clung to their bodies, making the death even more horrific. The death wasn't just a physical destruction, it was a mental and emotional collapse as well. The victim's mind, fully aware of the agony they were enduring, would gradually break down over the course of the execution. The fact that there was no way to escape the torment, no way to plead for mercy, would have pushed the condemned into a mental state of sheer despair. But how did the people watching react to this? How could they possibly find entertainment in such an appalling spectacle? The answer lies in the twisted nature of human psychology. In societies where violence was a norm, where suffering was part of the landscape of life, the boiling execution became just another form of entertainment, a collective thrill for a bloodthirsty audience that reveled in the suffering of others. It was the ultimate power move by the state, but it was also a reflection of the darker side of human nature. As we step into the next chapter, we'll uncover who these victims were, those who were thrown into the cauldron, their lives ending in such a horrific manner. What crimes had they committed, and who were they in the eyes of society? Were they truly criminals, or were they simply pawns in a much larger political game? The boiling cauldron wasn't reserved for just anyone. In fact, those who found themselves condemned to this gruesome fate were often far from your typical criminal. Their crimes, whether real or perceived, were often seen as transgressions against the highest levels of authority or moral order. But as we dig deeper into the lives of those who met their end in these scalding waters, it becomes clear that these executions were not just about punishing criminals. They were about creating an image, a message to the masses that certain crimes were unforgivable, no matter how minor they might seem. In the eyes of the ruling powers, boiling alive served a purpose beyond punishment. It was about making an example of people. The victims of these brutal executions were often those who had been deemed a threat to the social order, whether through theft, treason, or political dissent. And in many cases, the line between criminal and political enemy was thin, making the victims not just outlaws, but scapegoats for broader societal issues. One of the most common reasons for someone being boiled alive was political treason. This was particularly prevalent in ancient China, where emperors saw any challenge to their rule as an unforgivable offense. Political rivals, rebel leaders, or anyone who attempted to defy imperial power could be sentenced to the cauldron. In these cases, the boiling death wasn't just a punishment. It was a way to silence the opposition and send a clear message to anyone who might entertain similar ideas of rebellion. Treason wasn't merely a crime against the state. It was a direct challenge to the divine right of the emperor to rule unchallenged, and that kind of defiance was punished in the most horrifying way imaginable. But not all of the condemned were political figures. Some victims were simply ordinary people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. In medieval Europe, thieves, especially those who stole from the wealthy or the state, could find themselves condemned to death by boiling. The idea was that stealing wasn't just a crime against an individual, but against society itself. The punishment had to be swift and severe to act as a deterrent. And for the ruling elite, it didn't matter whether the crime was driven by desperation or greed. It was the fact that someone had dared to take what didn't belong to them. But as history tells us, the victims weren't always the true criminals. In some cases, people were sentenced to death not because of their actual deeds, but because they were seen as a threat to the established order. It wasn't uncommon for innocent people to be accused of crimes they hadn't committed, simply because they had fallen out of favor with those in power. One can imagine the fear that would have gripped the people under such a system. Fear not just of committing a crime, but of being accused of one and facing a punishment so extreme there could be no escape. Even more horrifying were the cases in which the condemned had no chance to defend themselves. For example, Those accused of witchcraft or heresy during the medieval witch hunts were often subjected to the boiling cauldron as a method of execution. These accusations were frequently based on little more than superstition or personal vendettas. And yet, once someone was accused, their fate was sealed. There was no trial, no defense. They were simply cast into the cauldron, their death a public spectacle that was both a warning to others and a source of entertainment for the masses. The question remains, why did the crowd cheer? It's chilling to think that a society could take such pleasure in watching another human being suffer. But the boiling punishment was not just about the victim, it was about the power dynamics of the time. The crowds were often composed of common people who had little control over their own lives. The spectacle of a brutal execution, especially one that was as prolonged and painful as boiling alive, became a way for the people to assert their own sense of justice. They may have been cheering not for the victim's pain, but for the reminder of their own place in society, a place where they were forced to watch, but never allowed to act. The boiling execution served as a grim form of collective release, a way for people to feel as though they were part of something greater, something that punished the perceived wrongs of society. But the victims of the boiling cauldron weren't just criminals in the eyes of the state. In many cases, they were seen as enemies of the people, individuals who had committed the most unforgivable offenses in a world that was quick to label anyone who didn't conform as a threat. And the execution became a symbol of societal fear, fear of the unknown, of rebellion, of chaos. It was a way of reaffirming that the rules could not be broken, no matter how much you were forced into a corner. In a chilling irony, the condemned often became martyrs in the eyes of some. Those who were executed in such a horrific way were sometimes elevated to hero status by those who believed in their cause or saw their execution as unjust. Their deaths, rather than being a final sentence, became a rallying cry for those who would continue to resist the established order. In some cases, the boiling cauldron may have been meant to destroy the individual, but it inadvertently fueled a movement. But as society evolved, the brutal boiling executions began to lose their grip. People began to question the morality of such practices, and with time, even the most powerful monarchs and emperors began to look for more humane methods of punishment. Yet the memories of these executions lingered, shaping the development of the criminal justice systems we have today, systems that, while less brutal, still carry echoes of this dark history. As we move into the final chapter, we'll uncover why this horrific practice eventually came to an end. The boiling cauldron became a symbol of an era that no longer seemed to fit in a more enlightened world. But before we do, let's pause to reflect on the dark legacy left behind. Why did it take so long for society to turn away from such a gruesome practice? And what does it say about us as humans when we find ourselves, even momentarily, reveling in the death of another? As the centuries passed and the world began to change, so too did the view on capital punishment. What was once considered an acceptable, even necessary, method of execution began to fade into the shadows of history, replaced by more humane forms of punishment. The practice of boiling criminals alive, once so popular and publicly celebrated, gradually came to an end. But why did it fall out of favor, and what remnants of this horrific tradition still linger today? The shift away from boiling as a method of execution didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process, one that was tied to the rise of Enlightenment thinking and the growing influence of human rights movements. As philosophers, lawmakers, and activists began to argue against the brutality of ancient justice practices, societies around the world began to question whether boiling criminals alive was a punishment that truly served the greater good. Were the blood-curdling screams of the condemned really achieving anything other than spectacle? Was it truly justice to prolong suffering for the sake of entertainment? The moral argument against boiling criminals alive began to gain ground in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in Europe. As concepts of human dignity and the sanctity of life began to shape modern legal systems, it became increasingly difficult to justify such a grotesque method of execution. It wasn't just about the pain inflicted on the victim. It was about the message that society was sending. Was this really the kind of civilization people wanted to be part of? A society that found entertainment in such suffering could hardly claim to be enlightened. One of the key factors in the end of boiling executions was the development of more efficient, less painful methods of capital punishment. By the 19th century, the guillotine had become the method of choice in France, offering a quicker, more humane alternative. Similarly, hanging and firing squads became common in many countries as a way to execute criminals without the prolonged suffering that boiling required. These new methods were seen as a more rational way of dealing with crime, one that minimized the physical agony of the condemned and, perhaps more importantly, the emotional toll it took on the public. But the practice didn't disappear entirely. There are still whispers of boiling death lingering in the corners of history. In some parts of the world, remnants of these ancient traditions can still be found, twisted versions of punishment that echo the horrors of the past. In some countries, certain brutal forms of execution are still carried out in secret, under the cover of authoritarian regimes where fear and control reign supreme. While these modern practices may not involve boiling criminals alive, they carry the same violent spirit, the same desire to display power through the destruction of human life. In addition to these dark remnants, the concept of public punishment and entertainment has morphed into new forms. Today, people still gather to watch violence and suffering, albeit in different ways. The rise of social media has given rise to a new kind of spectacle, one in which people film and share violent acts or cruel punishments as if they were no more than a form of entertainment. While the boiling cauldron is no longer a tool of execution, the desire to witness suffering for the sake of amusement remains ingrained in society in some disturbing ways. The decline of boiling executions marks the end of an era, but it also speaks to a larger story about the evolution of human civilization. We may no longer boil criminals alive, but we still struggle with how we deal with punishment, justice, and the human thirst for spectacle. The end of this horrific practice doesn't mean that the darkness it represents has disappeared. It has simply transformed into something more insidious and, perhaps, more dangerous. As we reflect on this chilling history, it's hard not to wonder how far we've really come. We may no longer condone boiling criminals to death, but can we truly say we've escaped the thirst for power and control that made such practices possible in the first place? In a world where violence is still used to maintain order, it seems we haven't fully left the past behind. Instead, we've simply found new ways to justify and conceal it. So, the next time we look at the systems of punishment that govern our world, let us remember the victims who perished in the boiling cauldrons of history. Their suffering may be long gone, but the legacy of that cruelty lives on, a haunting reminder of how easily a society can turn brutality into entertainment, and how long it takes for civilization to evolve beyond its darkest impulses. As we close this chapter on one of history's darkest and most gruesome punishments, we are left to wonder how much of this barbaric practice was a reflection of its time, and how much of it still exists in the world today. The boiling cauldron may be gone, but the thirst for power and control through violence is far from extinct. We must ask ourselves, what lessons have we truly learned from this horrifying chapter? The story of boiling criminals alive is not just a tale of past cruelty. It is a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the dark sides of human nature that still lurk beneath the surface. If you found this story chilling, leave a comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more dark and disturbing tales from history. The past holds many secrets, secrets that continue to shape our present in ways we might not even understand. Watch another shocking story to keep the truth coming. Final thought. How far have we really come in our treatment of others, and what does the future hold for justice in our world? The boiling cauldron might be gone, but the coldness in human hearts still remains.